Hello, my name is Cameron.
Hi, nice to meet you, Cameron. So we're here today to just have a quick consultation together about Andrea and her therapist meeting. We're going to be exploring the different counterproductive communication patterns and also giving some effective communication strategies based on
Mhm.
what we saw in her therapy session with her therapist at school. The meeting was originally supposed to be about the therapist learning about the student, her life, her goals, her family, and things of that nature. And then it switched over to being more about her drinking habits with her friends. So we can first just start off with the nonverbal behaviors. So what did you have for those ineffective nonverbal behaviors for that?
Yes, so originally the social worker was doing a really good job. She kept a very neutral, happy tone. She smiled throughout the session. She looked somewhat interested in what Andrea was talking about. And then when Andrea mentioned her alcohol abuse, is kind of when the it took a turn for the worst. So when Andrea disclosed her alcohol use, the social worker's facial expressions changed in which she began frowning, pursing her lips, and raising her eyebrows in more of a critical, if not judgmental way. And so all of these facial features, these facial affects signaled more judgment or discomfort and likely could have made Andrea feel more unsafe and probably more withdrawn from the session than when they initially started.
Right, right. I definitely agree. When Andrea started talking about her alcohol habits, I feel like the therapist definitely started lifting her eyebrows very critically. And I feel like raising her eyebrows is it's a critical thing, and it can communicate to the client that there's some form of judgment or just disapproval about whatever that patient or client is talking about. So I feel like in this sense, she could have just maintained a neutral, empathetic facial expression, even though she may not have approved. That's why it's important when you're a social worker, even though you may have cognitive biases, you need to be very aware of these things so that you don't lift your eyebrows critically or make certain faces that may make your client feel uncomfortable, or if there's a sign of disapproval, make them feel ashamed or anything of that nature.
Yes, I totally
What do you
agree.
what do you think that she could have done to what's an alternative, do you think, for this nonverbal behavior?
I agree. Um, by not keeping kind of essentially reverting back to how she was during the beginning of the session, right? Understanding that whatever Andrea's saying is kind of her perspective. It's, where she's at, not trying to force Andrea to stop drinking entirely. So kind of just keeping those biases to herself. This is one of those instances where it's very effective to kind of work on your facial features and how you react to client telling you things, both in your professional life and in your personal life as well. So I agree with you. Keeping her eyebrows lowered, keeping a neutral face, kind of understanding where Andrea's coming from, and not just hearing alcohol abuse, potential substance use abuse.
Right. And to add on that, I feel like she could have just kept with the soft nodding. I feel like in the beginning, she was definitely doing some nodding, which showed signs of like understanding. So I feel like she could have kept with that, which will also show signs of understanding without that judgment factor.
Yeah, of course. And it can show that the social worker's obviously listening, right? We're understanding what Andrea is saying, what the client is saying, even though we might not see what they're seeing and their point of view as, the direct right course of action. We're at least showing that we are understanding what they are conveying to us.
Right, right. And what did you have another reason? Did you have a second nonverbal behavior?
I did. So throughout, it was kind of more in the middle of the session, but another nonverbal issue, a nonverbal ineffective communication, was the social worker's body posture. She became very rigid, kind of crossing her arms at times and leaning back in her chair, kind of showing like more of a laid back, inappropriate, non professional manner of listening to the client and conducting the session.
Okay, I definitely understand. How do you think that this could be changed, or what's an alternative?
So first, I feel like the biggest thing for me with the video was that I would have liked for the social worker to be sitting in front of the client and not kind of at the weird angle that she was sitting at, but
Right,
then
right.
also kind of sitting upwards, straighter back posture, and not kind of like leaning back in her chair, very relaxed, unfolding her arms, keeping her arms by her side, arms in her lap, something that shows more of an open body posture and not something that's more closed and rigid.
Okay, okay. My second nonverbal behavior, I feel like in the video she was fidgeting with the marker towards the middle and end of the session when Andrea was really talking about her alcoholism, who she drinks with, and what she participates in outside of school. I think that this shows signs of nervousness or disengagement or just uninterested in what the patient is talking about. This can also show signs of judgment. So I think a alternative for this was just keeping her hands relaxed, which she was doing in the beginning. Also, keeping her hands still and only using her hands or other items for intentional gestures to emphasize her empathy for the client or the patient. I feel like not fidgeting with things also shows signs of focus and just being professional with that client.
Yes, I totally agree. And I did notice that as well throughout the session, which I think also Andrea noticed at some point. But yes, keeping her hands by her sides, like I said, folding her lap, just kind of anywhere that's not in view of the client to show that, she's fidgeting, right, twirling markers, playing with her rings, whatnot, is a great kind of replacement to that ineffective skill, that ineffective behavior.
Definitely, definitely agree with everything you're saying. So let's move on to the verbal behaviors, the ineffective verbal behaviors. I can start off with mine, and then you can go ahead and discuss yours. So the first verbal behavior that I noticed was judgmental and criticizing statements. I feel like the therapist, she indirectly blamed or criticized Andrea about drinking, which could cause defensiveness or just the client not being as comfortable and open about things going on in her life or her drinking, whatever she may have going on. I did write down a couple statements that I noticed that the therapist stated to Andrea that I feel like were confrontational, judgmental, as well as criticizing. She stated, "You've had some pretty heavy drinking." When Andrea was talking about how many drinks she's had in a day or how much liquor she's consumed, the therapist stated, "Oh, so you don't even know," which came out very criticizing and very judgmental. She even
Hmm.
told her, "Oh gosh, you're really drinking a lot." She told her the chances of her having bad consequences from her drinking, that she has a lot of chances of bad consequences. She told her again she was really drinking a lot. She also told her she really needs to stop drinking like that. She said a lot of judgmental things that could have made Andrea extremely uncomfortable and feel like she was being judged in so many different ways. So I feel like to prevent this, or a alternative for this would be to actually reflectively listen and actively listen, not be so judgmental, and just really listen and actively listen to invite that dialogue. Say prevent Don't say judgmental things and replace those judgmental comments with comments that'll make the client feel more open and honest about what they're going through, what they're partaking in, who's in their family, whatever the case may be. We just want to prevent ourselves from using those judgmental comments and just rephrase our language so the client feels more comfortable. Did you want to talk about your first verbal or should I go into my second?
Yes. I also wanted to piggyback off of that one too, because I loved how you talked about how she essentially was placing a lot of blame on Andrea for drinking. And later during the session, she was also the social worker was also, saying how that, and I quote, if you want to get into medical school, you're never ever going to get into medical school if you're drinking like this. And she also mentioned how Andrea, given her drinking, wasn't going to be able to handle college. So I think, like you said, actively listening, using empathetic listening, also understanding motivational interviewing too. We know that Andrea drinks, and she might not be in a position right now where she wants to necessarily stop drinking entirely. So the social worker should, utilize those motivational interview tactics, kind of gauge and see where Andrea's at, and not just kind of force sobriety or force no alcohol use on her.
Right.
And so moving into my ineffective verbal communication was the social worker using frequent leading questions. So during the middle of the session, the social worker asked Andrea, "Do you think you can quit drinking?" She also asked, "Does this mean that you're going to stop drinking?" So the social worker, kind of led with these questions that kind of indicated that the social worker wanted Andrea to stop drinking, even if that may have not been Andrea's goal during the session. And so the
Right.
social worker kind of continued on using some of these leading questions throughout the remainder of the session to kind of inadvertently and subsequently push her own agenda onto Andrea, right? So like I said, this is what the social worker wants Andrea to do, and she's saying it in a more subtle way that's not so overt. So, in this way, or in this manner, something that the social worker could do is kind of reframing the questions, not to kind of push her own agenda, but ask and see where Andrea's at, right? Like I said before, using motivational interview tactics. So, how does the idea of not drinking sound? Do you think that you would be in a stable position to no longer drink anymore? Using these kind of motivational tactics and frameworks will help the social worker kind of understand where the client is at, but also make the client feel more comfortable with their decision that they make ultimately.
Right. That kind of goes into my second verbal behavior. My second verbal behavior was advising and giving suggestions prematurely. When Andrea was talking about her drinking, the therapist jumped straight to, "You should stop drinking so much," or "Why don't you quit hanging out with those friends?" And that's very counterproductive. It's not really helping the client or the patient. So I think an alternative to this will be understanding the student's perspective instead of just giving her suggestions from the jump. She should ask open-ended questions and understand what the client wants to do instead of just forcing she thinks is best onto her. So asking those open-ended questions like, "What do you think you should do?" or "What should we work on?" instead of just saying, "Oh, you should stop drinking so much." Ask Andrea and include Andrea's input on the decision, and then you two can come with the decision collectively instead of just the therapist coming up with something for the patient or the client.
Yes, I agree. And so my last ineffective verbal communication was the way that the social worker was convincing Andrea through the use of lecturing, instructing, or arguing. So the social worker used a lot of kind of technical terms, and she stated that Andrea's drinking was considered high risk at this time as a method of convincing Andrea to cease alcohol consumption in its entirety. And she kind of used that title of that label of being high risk as a means to kind of coerce Andrea into subsequently not drinking anymore. And so instead of it being more of a two-way conversation of, hey, like, do you see your drinking as a concern to yourself, or does anybody else see your drinking as a concern? It became more of a lecturing where the social worker began kind of instructing Andrea on what she should do, informing Andrea of the consequences of drinking, and what can come about if you drink a lot, especially with Andrea trying to go to med school. So a better method that the social worker could have utilized is like you said, using open-ended questions, gauging Andrea's opinions more and not just kind of dominating the session with a bunch of substance use heavy materials and labeling Andrea as high risk, but also, like I said previously, understanding where Andrea's at with her drinking. So if she's ready to quit drinking, if she doesn't see it as a problem, kind of understanding where Andrea's at can ultimately help the social worker as well.
Right, right. I agree with everything you have said throughout this meeting. Everything you've said. Well, thank you for having this consultation with me. I hope that you have a great day.
Yes, thank you. You as well.